It's important to understand that deep geological disposal is not about closing the door and locking the key, but it's about planning the diffusion of radioactive material over a period of 1 million years. And you want to design these different barriers in a way that you can believe or plausibly argue that in 1 million years the radioactive dose at the surface will be below a certain threshold.
Welcome to Beyond the Fix. In this podcast, we take a closer look at solutions that science and technology aim to offer to today's most pressing problems. In this episode, we're talking about nuclear waste, that is the highly toxic radioactive byproducts of nuclear power plants. More specifically, we are looking at deep geological repositories supposed to fix the problem of radioactive waste for the next 1 million years. Today, we take a look behind the scenes of this fix, considering not only the scientific, but also the social and political dimensions. How can the uncertainties of a 1 million year time horizon be contained in such repositories? Why are there seemingly no alternatives to fixing the radioactive waste problem today? Or how did this fix come about historically? And what are the differences in dealing with nuclear waste across Europe? I'm your host, Thomas Kobel, and I'm glad you're tuning in. My guest today is a political geographer who studies the politics of nuclear waste governance in Switzerland and elsewhere. This is an issue where science, politics, and society are deeply intertwined. Because in order to decide how and where to store this waste for the next million years, you obviously have to get the science right. But just as importantly, you have to convince people and gain their trust. So it is really interesting to look at how the knowledge that informs the decisions of how and where to deposit the nuclear waste is actually produced. And this is exactly what Rony Emmenegger from the University of Fribourg is studying. Welcome to the show, Rony.
Thanks, Thomas.
Now, Switzerland isn't the only country where the political landscape around nuclear power is shifting, and we'll also get to that. But I think it would be more enlightening to start with you and your background, Rony. Can you share what a political geographer does and what drew you to the field of nuclear waste in the first place?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Thanks for the invitation. I'm a political geographer, so I'm interested in the relation between geography and politics, interested in human-environment relations. And I think nuclear waste disposal is a typical example for how humans rely on the environment, how they think about the environment, how they act within environments. And here the environment is not like at the surface. It's not quite the forests and trees and lakes that are concerned, but it's actually geology in the deep geological underground particularly.
So something that we cannot see at first glance, so it has to be made visible somehow, right?
Yes, I think what you highlight is like one of the specificities of this topic, that you can't simply dig down 1,000 meters to explore like how the geological underground is constituted, but you have to rely on modeling techniques, you have to go for seismic campaigns, you have to do drilling, which remains very partial. I mean, you can't just open the box and see what is underneath, but you get these little tiny insights at the surface, which you then have to interpret, and that makes it maybe to move a step forward, like it's on the one hand side, as you highlighted, a scientific exercise to gain a most accurate understanding of how the subterranean is constituted and to evaluate whether it is actually suitable for deep geological disposal. But then at the same time, it's also a question about how do people actually know how the subterranean is constituted? How can they themselves assess like what is underneath as a base to decide whether they trust into scientific expertise or not?
So it's obviously a very rich topic, but I mean, how did you get in touch first? What made you go there?
Yeah, I was looking after my PhD, looking for new themes. I had an environmental interest, an interest in environmental politics, and I wanted to work on a topic which concerns me. I'm from Zurich. We have a nuclear waste disposal proposal at the site close from where I live. And there was this sleepless night, I think in 2019, when suddenly this newspaper article came to my mind, and I woke up in the middle of the night and took notes, because this newspaper article was about the starting of a drilling campaign. So the Swiss nuclear waste organization AGRA actually started drilling into the subterranean in 2019, and I realized that this is just like something I find very interesting, like in terms of the materials it unearths, but also like the scientific exploration and like as I explained, that the question how the subterranean actually becomes part of a political process, or how knowledge about the subterranean gets produced and enrolled in the political process more broadly.
So if I understand you correctly, there was a sleepless night at the start of this. So did this process of this drilling and what could follow make you afraid in that moment?
I mean, afraid? No, I'm not really afraid. There are other issues I'm afraid of. Yeah, not really. I mean, in the focus was not the radioactivity. Fukushima was something to be afraid of, like, or let's say to be concerned with, because afraid, like you're quite far away. Nuclear power plants in Switzerland are there. Their safety is taken for granted almost. We just get the iodine pills and we don't worry too much. So I have to say, as many others in Switzerland, I'm not really afraid of radioactivity, but I'm politically concerned. And when I started to focus on the deep geological drilling campaign, I started off from a focus on nuclear waste disposal, but I soon realized that my research and my research interest is much more related to the geology. Like the idea of containment, the way rocks and geological layers and geology more broadly is actually proposed as a specific environment to contain nuclear waste. So also in research-wise, I moved more and more away from a focus on radioactivity and the question of whether I'm afraid of or not, towards a focus on geology and the question, what is my attachment to geology? And
So what do you actually do, or how do you approach it, like scientifically or methodologically?
Yeah, that's a good question, because like I'm a political geographer. Methodologically, I work almost like a social anthropologist. So I draw on qualitative research methods. So this means I do participant observation, I do interviews, quite informal interviews, sometimes more informal, sometimes more formal expert interviews on specific themes. And like for me, approaching that theme required to get into the process. So I started to visit the drill site, basically. And like I started to get a sense of who is involved and what the drilling is all about. So this led me to immerse into the geoscience on the one hand, but on the other hand also immerse into the socio-political context and the socio-political history of that drilling and the site selection more broadly.
So if I understood it correctly, you have a focus, or one of your focuses is on the process of knowledge production in that regard, right?
The key focus of my work, or maybe the key question is how societies can make sense of the subterranean, its constitution, and the question how does a society cope with the fact that knowledge about the subterranean is uncertain and extremely complex. And then like from that on, you have a couple of questions that follow, like what does it mean that uncertainty remains and cannot be resolved? So you will never have a moment when we know for sure that nuclear waste disposal is safe. It's just a promise we believe in, a promise which is also scientifically substantiated. And like you can then ask, like, what is the actual science behind? What does science actually do? What are the scientific assumptions? What's the, like we would say, epistemological limits of also a scientific approach, meaning that we have to ask how do science actually make sense about the future, for example, or about the geological underground in a context in which knowledge remains also kind of limited and will never be complete. And in parallel, I mean, this is more kind of the science studies, science philosophy focus. In parallel, I'm interested in the socio-political consequences of all this. So, like, why is it that people, for example, start to politicize the limitations of an image that visualizes the geological underground based on a seismic campaign? Or why is it that we trust in geology based on the encounter with a drill core? What does it mean if people say, okay, I trust in science because I visited the lab and heard a scientist speaking? So there's a much more political, socio-political dimension to that, to think about or to address this question, the question being like how society actually deals with the uncertainty of knowledge which is involved and inevitable in the context of nuclear waste disposal.
So you mentioned this uncertainty, right? And one thing that strikes me is this period of 1 million years that this waste has to be contained because of the half-life of the radioactivity. I mean, to me, this is a period that is pretty much unconceivable. I mean, Homo sapiens is said to have emerged like 300,000 years ago. So this is 3 times the history of whole humanity. To me, that's just unconceivable, right? Mm-hmm. But still, this is something that has to be addressed in this process somehow, this deep time, as they call it, so this geological time. What do you make of this, or what observations do you make around that topic?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that we actually have a 1 million year planning horizon. And I think it's interesting to think about how geologists manage to cope with this time horizon. So when I said before that we often assume that humans are unable to do so, but then in parallel, geology has evolved and emerged as a discipline who is claiming to think in geological timescales. And there are many geologists who argue that thinking in deep time categories is possible, that a period of 1 million years is nothing in light of broader geological processes. So I think it's interesting here to distinguish. Like on the one hand side, we can think about broader geological processes, and there, like a 1 million year period is just a second almost, yeah. But then at the same time, there is also a geological knowledge production process. So humans are skilled, are trained, have developed the capacity to know about these geological processes. And I think my interest is in understanding how geologists, geoscientists, and also safety case experts actually start to produce knowledge about these geological time spans. And it's like taking a more historical perspective. I think we also need to be aware that geology from the onset has been quite an experienced science. So people at the end of the 18th century, went around and discovered outcrops and experienced outcrops in the environment, and these were the actual encounters with deep time, which allowed them to think in deep time categories. So in a way, it is possible to go around in the landscape to start to think about all these geological, geomorphological, glaciological climate processes that shape the Earth, and start to build on our experiences to think about what it means or how the result of a 1 million year time period looks like. And from then onwards, I think we can move on and start to think about how also geology as a discipline has evolved, has pushed much more on modeling forward, calculation forward, and there are today much more kind of sophisticated tools to think about deep time.
So I think one central concept in that regard with these time horizons, this deep time, is also the notion of passive safety. So what is passive safety?
Yeah, passive safety builds on the idea that human involvement is not needed to secure safety in the long term. And for that, experts consider specific multi-barrier design through which passive safety can be achieved. And that works through the interplay of technical engineering barriers on the one hand and more natural barriers on the other hand. So you have usually canisters as typical technical barriers, and then you have the host rock as the natural barrier, and you have to backfill the canisters within the host rock. You have so-called geotechnical barriers that are bentonite clay in the Swiss case, which is a natural, but it's a material, so it's natural and geological at the same time.
So we can think of it like a safety vault, like in a bank, but just on a much larger scale and with much more barriers. And so, I mean, you really have to contain this, right?
Yeah, you really have to contain it. It's maybe important to understand that deep geological disposal is not about closing the door and locking the key, but it's about planning the diffusion of radioactive material over a period of 1 million years. So what you need to achieve at the end of the day is that radioactivity gets released in a sequence, so it breaks through the different barriers after a certain period, and you want to design these different engineering and natural barriers in a way that you can believe or plausibly argue that in 1 million years the radioactive dose at the surface will be below a certain threshold.
So it's not about containing the waste until it decays because of half-life, but actually about controlled diffusion.
Yes, and this is the key point. It's controlled diffusion, and like what you build with a multi-barrier system is kind of a temporal spatial regime through which you govern this diffusion in the long term, meaning that radioactive substances are contained within the canister for the next 10,000 years. Then the canister can break. Experts now need to prove that it remains stable until then. Once it breaks, like the next stage starts, the next barrier becomes relevant, and we again have an expectation about how long such barrier then has to last.
So maybe we can come back to this intersection of geology and politics, or the political discussion that you mentioned. So one demonstration of this link comes from a press conference from the Swiss authorities, where they announced the decision where the repository should be built. And the CEO of the NAGRA agency said, "The geology has spoken." We can listen to this. It's in German.
Es ist ein eindeutiger Entscheid. Die Geologie hat gesprochen.
So what's your perspective on this with your research background? So I think when he says the geology has spoken, he doesn't mean the science of geology, as I understand it, but like the geology itself, like the rocks and stones and clay have spoken. Mm-hmm. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, maybe before I address your question, it's important to contextualize this a little. The press conference happened on September 12 in 2022, and this was a historical moment in the Swiss disposal project, because here the CEO of NAGRA proposed one specific site. So since 2008, the site selection process has been ongoing. Like it focused on 6 sites initially, 3 sites then from 2016 onwards. And in the last stage from 2018 onwards, deep geological drilling was ongoing. The drilling campaign started in 2019, and the drilling campaign was undertaken primarily to complement the knowledge about the geological underground. So this went on and brought to the surface a more accurate, in brackets, knowledge about the subterranean, about the constitution of geology, and allowed NAGRA to compare the geology in these 3 different sites and led NAGRA to finally conclude that Nördlich Legen, one of these sites, is most favorable.
Which actually came as a surprise, didn't it? Because in the years before, they actually at some point wanted to exclude Nördlich Legen from the process.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there were 3 sites. All sites are characterized by a opalinous clay layer in the subterranean. And the safety analysis in earlier stages led to the conclusion that the other 2 sites would be more favorable. And NAGRA at that time excluded Nördlich Legen because of techno-engineering aspects. As I said, it's in Nördlich Legen, the site is deeper. So it's about 900 to 1,000 meters deep. And because it's deeper than the other sites, where the opalinous clay layer is about 500, 600, 700 meters depth, it's more difficult to construct. So it was not excluded on the basis of geology, but on the basis of a more engineering consideration. And this, raised questions, and that leads us back to the press conference, because the NAGRA CEO said geology has spoken, and he sold the proposal. That's maybe an important point. It did not select the site, but it proposed the site to be in the focus of the further investigation that is still ongoing, and the site selection is still a bit ahead. But this was the proposal. Yes, and it meant to propose that geology has spoken, that science has actually reached the conclusion that this is the best site. And in the follow-up to the press conference, you had a media debate, you had different discussions about whether this really is a political or a scientific decision. Like some people suspect this to be a political decision, like a suspicion that comes with a broader historical context, which we may want to explore, maybe not. Yes, and others argued simply that it's a scientific decision, and it was backed up by different expert committees, expert groups. So there was a consensus among the key stakeholders that this is science-based. Finally, let me come back to your question, because he kept it deliberately, I would say, I don't know, but I would say it's kept deliberately ambiguous. Geology has spoken means geology in a narrow sense is the science of the geos, the geological. So it's in a way science speaking. And if you listen to that press conference, like the first thing the CEO does after this statement is he says thanks to all those scientists who have been involved. Mm-hmm. So in a way, there's an acknowledgement of the broader scientific institutions, the scientific knowledge production process that led to that conclusion. But then at the same time, the Nagra CEO also held up a drill core, mm-hmm. saying like this is the actual rock which helps us to actually solve that problem of nuclear waste. And he kept on elaborating the properties of that rock, its age, its characteristics, like its abilities, its properties. And I think there suddenly the drill core became enrolled in the political process. As I argued before, suddenly like we get the idea that geology as kind of a force, in a way, as an actor, we would say, non-human actor starts to play a role in a political process. So it's no longer simply a human project, but it's a project which also involves the collaboration and the integration of non-human actors, as Opalinus here, Opalinus clay here represented only through a drill core, but more broadly, kind of we rely on an entire subterranean substrate that actually acts in a specific way for humans to solve the problem.
So, and what's the effect of this? Because I imagine, so if you shift it a little bit to this fear of the clay or the subterranean, that means it protects the discussion maybe from some scrutiny or from criticism, because this then has like an objective scientific thing around it, right?
Yeah, I definitely see the dynamics, and that's what's going on. Like I call it a geologization of nuclear waste disposal. It shifts the nature of the discourse and leads humans to primarily think about the suitability of the geological substrate. And as a process, you can really see it's there. Like the discourse, the discussions around deep geological disposal have focused very much on geology primarily. And it comes with the effect. It's important, like I would say it's an effect. It comes with the effect that we do not talk about nuclear waste per se, and that the broader questions related to nuclear energy, I mean, it's quite a current debate. And like here, I think it's important to understand that this is an effect, and it's another thing to say it's an intention and a deliberate strategy.
Yes.
So I would not go there. I'm not saying that this is a
sort of manipulative idea behind this.
That's not what I study in my more ethnographic-oriented research, because I start from like how people act in that environment, and I see how the drilling campaign becomes an issue and how like the experts start to think about how they can best communicate knowledge about the subterranean, and then like they realize like people have an interest, and then you communicate along these lines, and it's a good way to open up for the public to gain knowledge about the subterranean in new ways. It's another thing to say there's a nuclear industry that deliberately pushes this ahead. Like it seemed to be quite a valid argument in the past. I think it needs to be acknowledged. Like the nuclear industry has pushed nuclear waste disposal quite a bit for very strategic reasons, to actually be able to argue that the waste problem is solved as a base to legitimize nuclear power production. Here, I think also the institutional relations are important, like to understand that NAGRA, as the organization responsible for nuclear waste disposal, is actually in the hand of the nuclear industry and partially of the Swiss government. Like it's a corporation that has been created by the nuclear industry to solve that problem. And so that link has been institutionally always there. And it could be used to argue today that there's still at a broader level a link between nuclear energy and nuclear waste disposal. But I guess, as I said, as from an anthropological perspective, I'm interested in how people act, like what people think and what drives people to act in a specific way. And there, I mean, I've never heard someone telling me that like they want to solve the problem because they are interested in nuclear, kind of legitimizing nuclear energy. So it's more kind of an analysis that you would have to push forward at the institutional level.
Of course, I mean, and the problem is there. It has to be solved. It has to be solved on a national level. So you somehow have to proceed on that question.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And just, I mean, this is a very delicate issue also politically. That's why I may formulate this in different terms, but I think most of the people who are currently involved in the search for a site and in the nuclear waste disposal project cannot be reduced simply to actors that operate as puppets of a nuclear industry. And I think that's quite important.
Of course, this is not what I was suggesting.
Yeah, just to do justice to all these people who are involved. But like if you take another theoretical perspective, maybe a more kind of political economy approach where you think about the actual political relations of different institutions in a broader economy, then I mean you could come up with these claims. It would then, as I said, not do justice to the actual actors involved.
Can you maybe say something about the history of the discourse? Because as you said, maybe it has done quite something in the past. And also I grew up with the idea of deep geological repositories in Switzerland as a given. We just have to find the right spot, but this is what we're going to do, right? But I think it wasn't always so clear that it was going to be deep geological repositories. Can you maybe say something about the history of that discourse?
Maybe start in the broader geopolitical context, like from the 1950s onwards, after the use of first nuclear weapons, nuclear energy was globally reframed in this Atom for Peace conference. So like the peaceful use of nuclear energy was pushed forward and it changed the geopolitical climate quite a bit. So the 1950s and 60s have been characterized by a huge nuclear euphoria, like a celebration of what nuclear power can do. And you can even check YouTube channels for kind of videos from that time. It's incredible what people believe they can achieve through nuclear power, through nuclear weapons even, to dig new channels into continents and like really kind of a humanity believed to be able to really change the world quite fundamentally. And in Switzerland, you have then an emerging nuclear industry in the 60s and 70s with the building of nuclear power plants. And at the beginning, nuclear waste is not at all an issue. So people think nuclear waste is simply not considered in that broader context of the euphoria. Not at all. I mean, there are critical voices. It's also a political climate where critical, or in which critical voices were marginalized quite a bit. Yes, so like it has been there, but it was not kind of a key thing. And more, like environmental, it's also in the broader context of the 70s of environmental movements emerging and slowly taking nuclear waste as realizing that nuclear waste is one of these environmental concerns that need to be taken seriously. In the 1970s, waste gets increasingly into the focus, into the political attention, and this culminates also in Kaiseraugst in 1976, where people protest against nuclear plans for a new nuclear power plant. And like from the late 1970s onwards, it's clear that the nuclear energy cannot extend and no new power plants can be built without the waste problem being solved. From the late 1970s onwards, the nuclear industry is obliged to provide evidence that the nuclear waste problem can be solved. And like this materializes then in that Project Gewähr, the project guarantee, in which the nuclear waste organization tries to make a case that the nuclear waste can be safely stored. And this project is then developed initially in the granite bedrock. The geological exploration also starts in the early 1980s. And this project guarantee or Projektgewähr culminates in the submission of these project reports and allows then to say, okay, theoretically, nuclear waste can be disposed. Theoretic evidence is there, but it will not work in granite. And it will not, there is no site really where it can be advanced. And this allows then the nuclear industry to keep the nuclear power plants running. So there are no additional licenses granted, but the existing licenses prolonged, while it means for Nagra to shift its focus. So it shifts its focus from the investigation of granite as a host rock towards a focus on opalinous clay, which is in the focus today.
But I mean, was it always clear that this problem should be solved nationally? Or as far as I know, there was also discussions to just export the waste or maybe even shoot it into the space. I mean, that you just put it underground. Has it always been clear that this is the solution to go for?
No, definitely not. And until the 1980s and onwards, nuclear waste was disposed in the deep sea, small and mid-active waste particularly. Waste was exported to reprocessing plants in France and the UK. It's maybe important to say it's reprocessing, it's not recycling. So there are kind of substances that remain and it just lowers the amount of waste, but it does not resolve it for good. Yeah, and more and more it became clear that we need a national solution. So it's an international agreement almost that nuclear waste cannot be traded as such, and that each country producing waste needs to solve it within its own territory. And this then also meant to focus on the Swiss territory for a site. Yeah.
So, I mean, in this podcast, we also want to look behind the fix or behind fixes, right? And I would say in the case of nuclear waste disposal, the fix is not there yet. It's being developed. But still, I think what I learned from what you just said is that what has been very important is the promise that we can fix this, right? That in the future we will be able to deposit this. So we just have to engineer our way out of this sort of. So it's not a matter of if, but just of how, and we're going to be able to do this. So can you maybe say something about what is fixed by this promise of deep geological repositories? Or, I mean, would you agree on that take?
Yeah, I think I would agree on that take. I mean, the ultimate fix would be in 1 million years from now onwards. So we agree it's not possible to really provide evidence in a narrow sense of the term, to say, okay, we have proven that the nuclear waste problem is fixed, actually. But the fix entails to assume that deep geological disposal makes sense. And I think the techno-fix here builds on reductionist categories in the first place, to say, okay, that something can be fixed, like we have a proposal and it's fixed for good. And I think this idea of a fix in this sense is much more kind of a political construct than a scientific reality, I would say.
So if you say this is reductionist, in what sense or way, or what would be the non-reductionist perspective?
Yeah, it's reductionist in the sense that we build on a specific set of categories. And this means that we, for example, imagine geology to take over. We draw on quite a clear-cut distinction between the socio-political and the geological, to say, okay, once we have closed the repository, it's fixed, that the problem is solved. So also like this idea of passive safety, that we actually have a geological host rock that takes over responsibility for us, represents that fix. And it's reductionist as part of a political vocabulary, I would say. Like it's a promise which allows these projects to move on, both scientifically and politically. So it's this promise which makes scientists work. So that kind of explains why scientists in that field strongly believe that they can contribute to solving that problem. And this is kind of a genuine motivation. In parallel, it allows the broader public to say, okay, we have a fair chance to solve that problem. So we buy into these beliefs and we believe that it can be fixed by the scientists involved, and we therefore trust in the project and allow it to continue.
And also we can forget about it to some degree because it's an uneasy thought, right, to think about that problem, right?
Yeah, definitely. This forgetting, I think, is also political motivation. I think it feels comfortable for citizens, for
it does
society.
For me. It does for me.
To say, okay, it's solved. At the same time, like I would say, you create conditions which you have to cope with thereafter, and like nuclear waste will then be stored, and what's going on from then onwards can be predicted partially, but like it can only be anticipated in scenarios, and like you need to take it from there.
And also we might just not know yet what we don't know yet, right? So we don't know our gaps of knowledge, maybe, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting that deep geological disposal involves deep time planning and is motivated by this idea to fix the problem. But then at the same time, you have an entire scientific machinery operating actually to deal with these uncertainties. So there are quite sophisticated ways of kind of rationalizing uncertainty, to build future scenarios, to test these scenarios, to build kind of or model subterranean system that evolves over a period of 1 million years, and they are quite sophisticated tools to test the boundaries and the appropriateness of this system, to actually think in more appropriate terms about the future and to cope with the fact that the future is uncertain. And I'm highlighting this because it shifts a little bit the perspective, because for most of the scientists involved, I would say the techno-fix is not what drives the actual scientific involvement, because there you have a lot of people who really, as scientists, are aware that any kind of prediction is uncertain, and or that any scenario is just a plausible reality, but will never
it's
be
not a prediction, right?
Prediction. And so I think it's maybe, to put this in a nutshell, we often accuse scientists to push forward the techno-fix. But I think the techno-fix is much more kind of pushed forward in the political realm. But the actual science behind is often more complex. And it's an interesting relation between kind of simplification, which pushes projects like deep geological disposal forward in a broader political context, and the actual science exercise that involves to a degree an understanding of the limitation of scientific results and scientific evidence.
So when you said before that this is also a reductionist perspective, you would say this applies more to the political discourse rather than the scientific discourse? Or, I mean, is it even possible to have a holistic perspective, which would be the contrary to the reductionist perspective?
I think the reductionist perspective comes in primarily in the political realm, I would say, where you have to propose easy solutions for complex problems. Like you can see that you need to reduce a very complex phenomenon to something simple. And the simple version of the story is quite close to what we call the techno-fix. Here it's important also to understand that the simplification is not just kind of, not necessarily only kind of a deliberate strategy to cheat, but it's also a demand. So like pushing forward such a project in a broader political context with a contested history also requires you to, or as a communication expert, it requires you to find out like what is the appropriate version of the story for a particular audience. And I think it's interesting because depending on the audience, you may push forward the techno-fix more or less.
So you investigate the link between geology and politics, among other things, but that's one of your key topics, right? And so I imagine in countries with different geology, also the politics are different, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of my key interests. I mean, in Switzerland, the Deep Geological Disposal Program focuses today on opalinous clay. So the material has specific properties and is considered quite suitable for deep geological disposal. But in other countries, like in Sweden, for example, you don't have clay, you only have the bedrock, so granite. And the project focuses on granite. And this now comes with specific political consequences. Why? Because Sweden started to explore also in the 1990s, and it became clear that there's no alternative option. So you start your site selection process in granite, and at some point the Deep Geological Disposal Program was reframed. Sweden, and the search shifted from the initial search from the best geological conditions for a repository towards a good enough geological environment. And like this kind of...
And this is because the granite, it's very hard and solid, but once it has a crack, I mean, water gets through and it's not as good as this Opolinus clay, for instance. Right?
Yes, and granite we assume is really stable, and that's like what we can experience. It's like the hard rock, really. But in a long-term perspective, it's much more fragile than Opolinus clay under certain circumstances. And as soon as it cracks, yes, water goes into it.
And so what's the consequence on the politics?
Yeah, that the consequence is, like in Sweden, for example, this reframing of the search for a good enough geology created a new political context in which then also certain sites could simply volunteer as host communities. So a certain kind of a political sitting process was only possible under conditions that geology was no longer the ultimate criteria for the site selection process. So in particular, like Östhammar, Forsmark has volunteered in Sweden as a site. It did so because there is already a nuclear power plant there, so acceptance was relatively high. And as geology was no longer in the focus, also the political discussion changed. And today, for example, the main controversy around the disposal project is not so much whether geology is stable or not, because the initial search was only for good enough geology, and the focus is primarily on the suitability of the canister to actually hold or contain nuclear waste. And it's also a good example now to see the diversity of the disposal concept and the way this multi-barrier concept is in a very specific interplay in these different countries. So in Switzerland, we have Opolinus clay, the natural barrier, which is most important for site selection. In the Swedish case, geology is not, it is important, but of secondary priority, and the concept relies more on the engineered barrier. And as a consequence of the way this multi-barrier concept is built into the geological context, also the political debates and the political controversies
are
different, yes. And so you have, like today, controversies about the stability of the canister, as it has to contain nuclear waste for much longer than the canister, for example, in the Swiss repository design.
So I wonder if one reason for differences between Switzerland and Sweden is also that Sweden is much less densely populated. And so maybe, this not in my backyard phenomenon is less pronounced in Sweden. Do you see this?
Yeah, internationally there are examples where this is really a reason for nuclear waste site proposals. But I think what is important in the Swedish case is that the two sites that actually volunteered in the search process were those with pre-existing nuclear facilities. So we can say in some countries we really have this kind of center-periphery relations, and then it's maybe economically attractive for a peripheral region to host a repository for economic reasons. But then, like, you also see that, for example, in all these areas where nuclear installations exist, you have a higher acceptance rate and synergies, technological synergies, so that the whole range of scientific technical reasons why proximity makes sense, but there is also the social political context, which means that these kind of projects that often face local resistance do not face local resistance in these areas where nuclear waste is relatively well accepted.
So before we conclude this episode, let's get back to the current situation in Switzerland. Like in other countries, the perspective on nuclear power has changed multiple times. Nuclear power seemed to be more and more outdated and too expensive and risky compared to renewable energies. And then, as you mentioned, the Fukushima catastrophe happened. Germany decided to quit nuclear energy also altogether. And also in Switzerland, we had the decision to prohibit the construction of new nuclear plants. That was confirmed by popular vote in 2017 with the Energy Strategy 2050, as it was called. And yet, now with the war in Ukraine, the threat of energy shortage, and also the awareness for the current need of carbon-neutral energy, nuclear power has sort of made a comeback. And in the summer of 2024, the Federal Council with Energy Minister Albert Rösti decided to end the ban on new nuclear plants, which isn't implemented yet, but still that's the process that's going on. So what are your thoughts on this sort of nuclear renaissance?
Yeah, there has been a debate about the nuclear renaissance already since the summer 2021. I think when Matula Blocher actually brought this up on the table, and it has evolved. And I think this summer with Federal Councillor Rösti, it reached again a culmination point. Yes, and I mean it's interesting because for the last few years I have asked myself like what the significance of all this is for my research. I mean historically, as I elaborated early on, you can really see a link between nuclear waste and nuclear energy. So this cannot be denied.
Obviously.
I mean nuclear energy produces nuclear waste, and we have gone through a historical process through which the themes are more and more disconnected. And this is not only the case in Switzerland. So we have also in terms of research, social science research, we do not have really a lot of scientific research that focuses on the interlink between energy and waste. So you have...
That's surprising to me actually, is it? Because I mean, it can't be separated, right?
Yeah, it can't be separated. A very important exception is Gabriela Hecht's book on being nuclear, where she really traces like the entire fuel cycle from the resource extraction site into the broader geopolitical realm. And there are a few exceptions that need to be mentioned, but a lot of literature on nuclear waste governance focuses on sitting on nuclear waste. And then in parallel, you have a discussion about nuclear energy. So this even in the scientific realm, in the social science realm, you have this split and this divide. And I think it has affected politics. Like we can ask about what comes first, but also in the broader socio-political discussions, the nuclear waste and nuclear energy are more and more disconnected. In Switzerland, I think this disconnect was ultimately sealed with the decision for the phase-out, because before anti-nuclear forces or voices have always blocked nuclear waste disposal plans or projects because they did not want to get involved in a process that in the end legitimizes nuclear power plants. So I think the phase out, Fukushima and like the energy strategy 2017 kind of sealed that divide even more, that we do not think about nuclear energy in direct relation to nuclear waste. And I think this leads me back to your initial question. It's very interesting now to see we have all this discussion about the nuclear renaissance, and we do not really talk about waste. And just to illustrate that, there was an arena, like the discussion round for politicians from the different parties, usually in Switzerland, broadcasted through the Swiss television. And it lasts, I think, 75 minutes. And there was a discussion about the nuclear renaissance. And it took a full hour, I think you can check, 59 minutes, until all the downsides of nuclear waste became listed. And there was a politician quite critical of a nuclear renaissance who started to list, and he did not list nuclear waste among the 3 key problems.
Wow.
So this tells us a lot about the nature of the political discourse around nuclear energy and nuclear waste. And it's quite an interesting observation. And after that politician actually brought up that list, there was a short information video produced by the Swiss television which listed waste. So it came up, and it led in the follow-up to a discussion when some people started to claim that the nuclear waste problem is already solved. Like the others started giggling in an ironic way, also in a shocked way, like how can you really claim it's solved? And like here you can really see that like the techno-fix comes in. Is it solved or is it not? And I think there are many arguments to be discussed in relation to a nuclear renaissance, sustainability, the reduction of the problem to CO2 equivalents, and so forth. But that's not where I want to go. But I think from my research background, it's just threatening to see how banalized nuclear waste is in this discussion. And I think we have a good example for how the techno-fix actually comes up. And I think it's important here also to make that point. I mean, it also does injustice to all these actors who are actually involved in the nuclear waste disposal project. I mean, from the host community, the activists who agreed to join the project and collaborate, but also like the scientists who now believe they contribute to the solution of a problem. And I think the debate about the nuclear renaissance actually opens this link and these broader political questions about the link between nuclear energy and waste quite a bit. And it will be interesting in a couple of years, whatever we decide, to reevaluate like the current political situation and the current deep geological disposal project once we start to say, okay, now we need new nuclear power plants.
So maybe we can leave it at that, but still I want to ask you one last question. So you have spent years researching this topic, right? The problem of nuclear waste repositories, of the governance, of the knowledge production, of the socio-political implications, and so on. So what is, if any, what is your most important takeaway for somebody who hasn't given much thought to these repositories so far?
Yeah, that's maybe already the most important takeaway. If you have not yet given much thought to it, give a thought to it. Yes, I mean, I think we live in an era where planning horizons get more and more distant, where we have to deal with increasingly complex, increasingly uncertain problems. And I think a key take-home message is that we need to draw more attention to what is going on and kind of move away from asking the question whether the problem is fixed or not, to focus on what kind of science it actually involves. I mean, a lot has been written about the nature of science, the relation of science to politics, the relation of science in democratic societies, and on and on. And I think we need to understand or put more emphasis on the role of science in contemporary democratic societies generally. I need to understand what science does, and especially what it does not. And do not simply blindly trust in science, but reappropriate science to say, okay, this is what science actually can do, and that's what we appropriated. And
so maybe to think about the knowledge production itself also more.
Yeah, the knowledge production, the way it works, to understand the scope of what science can do in this broader context in which we have to take responsibility for waste. Whether we like it or not, we can trust in science, but and there's maybe good reasons why we should trust in science and why we should go for a deep geological repository. But even if we as a society decide that this is the path we want to go, then I think we need a critical group of citizens who is able to understand like what the risk is or remains, and in case something goes wrong, we want to be sure that we have taken this decision on informed grounds. And informed decision making is not just a responsibility of politicians, but I think it's also, especially in Switzerland, a responsibility of citizens who finally can have a say in case a facultative referendum will happen in 2030 on the nuclear waste disposal project. And being informed does not only mean to trust, but to get a sense of what you buy into and what kind of science you rely on. And as I said, I leave it everyone to make his or her own decision then, but dig into science and think about what it does and what it does not.
Thank you so much for coming to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas.
In 2 weeks, we will talk with Angelika Hilbeck about new genetic engineering technologies in agriculture and the scientific premises and economic promises at their basis. Beyond the Fix is brought to you by Critical Scientists Switzerland, an independent network of Swiss researchers, and is made possible by the Stiftung Mercator Schweiz. Music by Mich Gerber.